the Earth. It was the complement of the Earth. All these orange and yellow materials in here for the moon were actually ancient rocks, older than 3 billion years old, maybe 4 billion years old for the most part. They represented the missing part of Earth history that we've been looking for. It was like a Rosetta Stone. Here it is. Here's what we can't see on the Earth. These rocks here were younger, and we were able to actually take a look at them. We have a whole host of rock types from all these terrains, and indeed, in an even more unbelievable thing, my introductory class of the 200 people that Joel was talking about actually can look at these in the lab, lunar rocks and thin sections, and reconstruct the history of the crust as part of a freshman exercise. Just amazing. It's just amazing. We can also take a look at the ages by dating the rocks that were brought back, and we have a chronology of the moon as well. And we found out from these rocks something very unusual had happened to the Earth. From the isotopic signatures, it was determined that the hypothesis that was thought to be outlandish years ago, that the moon formed from the impact of a Mars-sized object into the very early Earth, was very likely to be true. What happened was that a Mars-sized object, half the diameter of the Earth, hit the Earth. The ejecta from that sprayed out and made a ring-like structure, like Saturn, and then these things collected together and formed the moon. This seems to be still the prevailing hypothesis. Now you can see, I'm looking back at the early history of the Earth. I want to know why the Earth is the way it is today. That's a traumatic event, okay? That has had to have shaped the evolution of the Earth in a serious, serious way, ways that we don't even fully understand yet because we don't have another Earth right nearby. But that's really important. This is one of the perspectives that we've gotten, is that the Earth and the moon are inexorably interlinked, and understanding them both as a pair is really important in our perspective on our own home planet. So I'm not going to describe these things here, but we learned a dozen fundamental things about the moon. And indeed, the moon is a record of the first half of solar system history. And we've learned a lot about the interiors, the ancient age of the crust, all sorts of things that give us insight into what was going on in the formative years of Earth history. What about Mercury? Mercury is really unusual in the sense that if you take a look here, Mercury, shown in orange, is closest to the sun. It's about a little larger than the moon. It's about a third the diameter of the Earth, but its density is way, way huge. So it's like an Earth with a huge iron core in the middle. In fact, just has a small amount of mantle and crust on top. So what does a planet like that look like? Here's another experiment we're performing. What does it look like when you take an Earth-like interior and have a very thin mantle, totally different than the moon, for example? Well, it turned out from exploration, by Mariner 10, that Mercury is moon-like. The surface looked like the moon. So an extremely unusual thing. Why would it look like the moon if it's so much like the Earth in the interior? So we began to rethink what the Earth's interior was like and what influence it had had on the geology. So we found that it's a one-plate planet. So instead of multi-plated planets like the Earth, with plates rejuvenating each other throughout its geological history, its plate became solid early on, like the moon's, and stayed that way throughout solar system history. That's why we can see the record of the geological history of the planets. So it's amazing. This is another piece of the puzzle about early Earth history. So Mariner 10 raised more questions than it answered. We found that we see a lot of plains, this blue material in here, but we couldn't tell whether they were volcanic or not. So a host of different questions came up that were generated by this early exploration, and fortunately we have MESSENGER on the way to Mercury. It just completed its second flyby. We've had 2 flybys, Mercury 1 in January of 2008, Mercury 2 just last Monday, actually, a week ago yesterday. And we've gotten some absolutely stunning views of the surface. Here is a sequence from that Monday pre-planned sequence on board the spacecraft. The spacecraft went within 200 kilometers of the surface, as I mentioned, and it performed flawlessly. An unbelievable encounter. From this, we're able to take and play back images, like you can see here. We can take these, look at the individual images, mosaic these together like we see here. Now, you're probably maybe the 300th or 400th people that have actually seen this. This is new terrain for Mercury. We got 30% of the surface never before seen by humans. It's stunning. It's just amazing. All kinds of new things going on. We're just digesting it. The students are totally excited. And I'm embarrassed to be away from the lab because they're going to figure everything out by the time I get back, for sure. And look at these views. These are views of terrain never before seen on Mercury. Beautiful impact craters, unusual terrain associated with a filling of craters. Circular, it looks like an upside-down bottle cap. Who knows what's going on here? And indeed, lots of flooding, tectonic modification, a treasure trove of new information about the planets. And Mars, what about Mars? We're moving up in diameter here to about 1/2 the diameter of the Earth. What do we know about Mars? What have we learned in the last decades of Mars exploration? Well, again, the Soviets had a number of missions there, particularly Mars 2 and 3. You can see the commemorative pins from these. That's about all I have left from Mars 2 and 3 are commemorative pins because they weren't successful in getting there, sadly. But, of course, Viking was the beauty here. So Mars not only is 1/3 the diameter of the Earth, but, in fact, it has an atmosphere, a CO2 atmosphere, a thin one, a critical aspect here. And we've learned an incredible amount from Viking. Viking, of course, with the orbiters and the landers were very complementary. 2 of each spacecraft, Viking 1 and 2, orbiters and landers, were successful on the surface, lasted for a long period of time, and provided us with our first global view of this planet and really revolutionized our thinking about other planetary bodies. We saw, in fact, that there were polar caps with polar deposits 3 kilometers thick of water ice. We saw details in later exploration of the layers in those polar caps. Today, with MRO, radar, we can actually see inside the caps and measure the layers and look at them crossing the surface. We see evidence in the past history of Mars for huge outflow channels, tremendous outpouring of water on the surface that probably created oceans in the northern lowlands for certain periods of time, maybe tens to hundreds of millions of years. We're still trying to figure that out. And early in the history of Mars, we see, in fact, evidence for clays and other minerals that indicate a lot of water on the surface. Later on, we see pretty much something like Antarctica, a hyper-arid cold polar desert, as the water on Mars became sequestered, and it became, again, not like a warm, wet Earth, but more like Antarctica is today. That is indeed why we go there. But take a look at what MRO is showing. Here are details of the structure of the polar cap. The radar is penetrating through, so we can actually correlate these layers. Here is an area on the edge of a crater, and you can see snow and frost in here. And, you know, we've had arguments and arguments and arguments about how these little gullies form here. Well, I mean, there's water in there, there's ice. When it warms up, it melts and it flows. This is the kind of thing which is like a smoking gun. We take a look at these delta deposits. You can see a channel coming out here. We can look with CRISM at the mineralogy of these, and we can understand what's going on and the fact that there was water in this crater when these delta deposits were placed. We can actually look at the hydrological cycle and system on Mars. We can understand what's going on in the polar caps, in the soils, where the water is going as a function of time. And indeed, Joel Levine is co-sponsoring here in Williamsburg a conference on the Mars atmosphere in the coming months. It's a huge and very important endeavor in modeling the atmospheres with general circulation models and linking that to the geology. And here's a perspective view looking up to the North Polar Cap. You can see the polar cap under here. Here's the polar hood in the atmosphere. Look at these storms. You'd hate to be, all you pilots out there, think about flying through this stuff. I mean, nice fronts moving through and so on. It turns out that Mars' rotational axis, think about the planet rotating, okay, when that moves around, that's a change in obliquity, the obliquity of the rotational axis relative to the plane of the ecliptic. The Earth moves a little bit, but it's stabilized by the presence of the Earth's moon. Mars doesn't. They got a couple of space spuds, Phobos and Deimos. They're not really much, okay? So this thing goes all over the place. Mars's obliquity can actually go to 80-some degrees. Now, when you point the polar cap to the sun, interesting things happen. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the water is mobilized and it moves towards the equator. So we see, when we increase the obliquity here, that water moves towards the equator. And we're mapping out with these new data. This is just a view of, this is the equator right here. Every one of these places that has a little indication here is an area we find sequestered ice deposits from previous glaciations. We even see evidence for huge tropical mountain glaciers on the sides of the volcanoes. This is Mars climate history. It's an incredible thing to study to get reference for the Earth. Here is the Earth. Here's some glaciers. Look at this deposit here in the Mars mid-latitudes. Exactly the same kind of thing. We just got Sherrod data back, penetrating through these things, and it's solid ice beneath the debris cover. This is where the atmosphere is gone. It's being sequestered away and stored in different places. We go to Antarctica to look at the ancient ice, to study the climate history of the Earth. We can go to Mars, dig down here, look at the ice, and study the ancient history of Mars. And if you talk about all the arguments about whether there's water on the moon, you know, in mid-latitudes and even in the equatorial regions, well, I would take water with me, okay? But I am really sure that there's ice below these based on the Sherrod data. So this is